This is the story of Roanoke, the Lost Colony, by Jane Yolen and Heidi Elizabeth Yolen Stemple. This book tells the story of a group of people from England who came to the American continent in the 1500s to begin a new settlement called a colony. This was the first English colony in the New World, but they all disappeared. Though lots of people have ideas or theories about what might have happened, no one is sure. This is how the story goes. In the year 1587, England and Spain were at war. A major battleground was the New World. And scholars, you might recall, Elizabeth I was the queen at that time. And it's also a time when the power of being the country with the most power changed from Spain to England. Along the east coast, forts were scattered. The one at Roanoke was manned by English soldiers, as you're seeing in this picture. It was an early colony of 108 men complaining about the harsh conditions and lack of supplies. They had returned home. They had been poorly prepared for life in the New World and had depended upon the native people for food while treating the native people badly. There had also been frequent fights, and the colonists had infected the native people with European diseases by accident. A native chief had been killed. This was not a good way to start a new colony. New soldiers had arrived at the abandoned fort to hold it until the new colonists could arrive. And colonists were sure to come. The promise of gold and farmland in the area were too strong for any complaints to matter. John White was a loyal Englishman and an artist. He was chosen to lead the colony by Sir Walter Raleigh, who had been given the charter document permission to use the land in Roanoke. This permission was granted by the Queen. John White may not have had leadership skills, but he had already been to the New World. He had brought back paintings of new plants, new animals, the native people. The colonists were chosen by Raleigh and White themselves, and they picked people that they thought would be able to build this new community, this new colony. There were more than 60 men, farmers, craftsmen who could build things, assistants, and there were close to 20 women, including John White's very own daughter, who was pregnant at the time. The women would work in the fields and the houses. There were also almost a dozen children. Two native men were also part of White's group. One of them, Manteo, had traveled in the company of the English before. John White hoped they would help the colonists with the local native people. He knew that the earlier colonists had had problems with fighting, diseases, killings, though he had never told Walter Raleigh about it. He was sure that with the soldiers already at the fort and with Manteo to help, he could keep the colonists safe and keep peace with the native people of the area. The colonists left England on April 26th, 1587. They planned to meet with the soldiers and then go a little further north of Roanoke to Chesapeake Bay. The land in Chesapeake Bay was more fertile, and the harbor was safer from harsh weather conditions. They sailed in three boats: a flyboat, a small rowboat called a pinnace, and their flagship, the Lion. After a month and a half at sea, they finally reached the Americas. They stopped first on several islands along the way. At the island of Santa Cruz, several colonists ate green fruit that caused their lips and tongues to swell badly. Some washed their faces in the ocean water, and the salt of it caused their eyes to swell up for 5 or 6 days. While there, they captured 5 huge tortoises, which they used for meat. The tortoises were so large, 16 men became exhausted hauling them back to the ship. At last, the flagship dropped anchor outside Roanoke's shallow harbor. John White and 40 of his men planned to take the small boat to shore to meet with the soldiers who had been waiting there. And then they would go on to Chesapeake Bay, remember where they were going to be staying. But the ship's pilot, named Simon Fernandez, had other ideas. He refused to take the colonists any further and made them all go ashore at Roanoke. When John White and his men got to the fort ahead of the larger group, they found it destroyed completely, having been torn down. Great melon vines grew in what remained of the houses, so much time had passed. All that was left of the soldiers was one single skeleton. Well, said White, we must make the best of what we have. So they began work on repairing the houses. While work continued on the buildings, one man, named George Howe, went fishing alone. He waded into the shallow water, trying to catch crabs with a small forked stick. When he did not return, the others went searching for him. They found him dead, filled with arrows. The colonists, the colonists suspected that Indians had killed him. John White sent Manteo and 20 men to Croatoan Island, where the nearest native people, the Croatoan tribe, lived. They approached the village with their muskets drawn, which frightened the Croatoan people, who were peaceful. They saw Manteo, who translated the story. He found out from the Croatoans this information. There were 4 soldiers in a boat fishing. 30 of our enemies from other tribes surrounded them. Both sides had men killed. The soldiers who were not hurt ran to the boat and rowed away. We never saw them again. George Howe had been killed by those same people. The Croatoan people then asked for a token from the English that would be a signal of friendship between the two groups. The English would not give any such token. Later that same week, the English mounted a surprise attack in the middle of the night on the people that they thought had killed Howe. Spotting a campfire, they shot one man and chased many others through the reeds, including women and children. But the colonists had made a terrible mistake. These were actually the friendly Croatoan people who had come to the area to gather corn, peas, pumpkin, and tobacco, thinking their enemies had left the area. On August 18th, John White's daughter, Eleanor, gave birth to her baby. She named the baby Virginia Dare, and this, scholars, was the first English child to be born in America. This was cause for great celebration, but summer was drawing to a close, and the colonists were getting worried. They were quickly running out of supplies. No one knew they had stayed on Roanoke Island. Remember, they were supposed to be in Chesapeake Bay, which was 50 miles north of there. Should they move there? Should they send someone back to England to let them know where they were? Well, John White was pressured to go back to England to relay the information. He hated leaving his daughter and his brand new grandchild, but the colonists were convinced he was the best man to go back and report the information. So, he buried his notebooks, his drawings, maps, his armor, and he worked out a special code with the colonists. He said, "If you leave, carve your destination on a tree. If there has been trouble, carve a cross." And then, 9 days later, on the 27th of August, White set sail back to England. White left Roanoke in a storm. The crossing of the Atlantic Ocean was an awful trip. He was desperate to round up supplies and desperate to get back to Roanoke Colony quickly. But a war and the blocking by the Spanish Armada kept him in England. There was nothing he could do. A half a year in the spring, White tried again to sail with two small ships with sailors, 15 new colonists, and some supplies. The sailors who were along insisted on doing some pirating along the way. So they attacked not only Spanish ships, but a Scottish boat and a French ship as well. White was wounded 2 times in battle during these pirating moments. All of the colonists' supplies ended up being stolen, and the ships turned around and went back to England. Then, in March of 1590, before Raleigh could gather enough money to send any other ships, sorry, it was March 1590 before he could gather up enough money. Another 5 months went by. Having survived storms, the ships finally reached the tip of Croatoan Island. Even though it was evening, White and his men could see smoke rising from the area of the Roanoke fort. In the morning, they tried to row ashore in 2 small boats, but the waves were terribly big. One boat capsized, and 7 men drowned. Anchoring in the shallow harbor that night, they tried to alert the colonists by sounding a trumpet, by singing English songs loudly, and by calling out to the people on shore. But no one answered. In the morning, they went to the fort. The fort was completely empty. Carved into a tree near the village were the letters CRO. On one of the posts was the word Croatoan. It's important to also note there was no cross carved anywhere to indicate there had been any trouble. All that they found inside the fort were bars of iron, pigs of lead that are used in shooting, and some iron shot. Chests that had been buried were dug up, overturned, and had been dug through with things taken, including John White's own possessions that he had buried to keep safe. The small boat, called the pinnace, was also gone, and weeds were growing everywhere. John White returned to England due to storms, a lack of money, and some other things that happened in history. He never set foot back in the New World again. But some other explorers certainly did. So, what really happened to them? No one really knows. Still, to this day. Here are some theories that historians have considered. The first one, the no survivors theory. People who believe that theory, right, think the colonists of Roanoke were killed by a tribe of the native people who wanted revenge. The absorbed by native people theory. People who follow this theory think the colonists lived with the native people and eventually became part of the tribe by either marrying into the tribe or by perhaps being captured and used as enslaved people. The lost at sea theory. People who believe this theory think the colonists tried to sail home to England but got lost at sea and never made it. And the split community theory. People who follow the split community theory think the majority of the Roanoke colonists took the boat and sailed north to get to Chesapeake Bay, leaving behind a small group at the fort, and that the smaller group eventually left to go to Croatoan Island. Why? No one's sure. And then, scholars, there's even a fifth story, a fifth theory, called the White Doe theory. This is a legend or a folklore, a myth perhaps. There is a legend that says Virginia Dare, remember that first English child born in the New World, was raised by the Croatoan people, and that when she refused to marry an old medicine man of the tribe who loved her, he had her turned into a white deer. Even today, people claim to see a mysterious white deer bounding through the North Carolina forests near Roanoke. Hmm, is there a theory that you think could be true? But remember, nobody knows for sure what happened to them. Still to this day, no one really knows.